Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you all to our program here on race, inequality, and language and education. My name is Kendra Shvomahin, and I'm a fourth year in the RILE program and happy to be here with you all. So before we introduce our speaker for our final speaker series of the spring season here, I want to introduce our moderator. So Francis A. Pearman is an assistant professor of education in the Graduate School of Education here at Stanford University. His research and policy interests concern social inequality, racial stratification, and educational disparities in the contemporary US city. His current research examines connections to and consequences of gentrification with respect to modern schooling, including the impacts of school choice on urban redevelopment efforts and the effects of gentrification on school discipline and achievement patterns. Throughout his research, Pearman combines rigorous quantitative methods with careful attention to how big data, including geocoded crime statistics, business information, and local voting patterns, might open up new sites of inquiry in the field of education. His research has been published in a variety of leading journals, including American Education Research Journal, Sociology of Education, Review of Educational Research, Urban Education, and the American Journal of Criminal Justice, and has been featured in a variety of media outlets, including The Atlantic and City Lab. Pearman holds a PhD and MED from Vanderbilt University and a BS from the University of Virginia. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Pearman.
Thank you, Kendra. That was like an extensive introduction for the moderator, right? We're gonna jump right into it. So Jerome's coming, excuse me, Professor Morris is coming to us from University of Missouri, St. Louis. Phenomenal scholar, can't say enough about him. Studies issues related to housing, schooling, policy. Has like a really kind of unique kind of geographical sort of interest in his analysis. Right, he comes to this topic, and he'll share, I suppose, quite a bit about his kind of background experience growing up in a Southern context. I'm thrilled to hear from him today. I got a whole lot that I could say, but I'm gonna wait until the moderation so we can kind of get right to the presentation. Please join me in welcoming Professor Morris.
Thank you, Professor Pearman. All right, I'm gonna turn this microphone on. Good afternoon. All right. Great to see everyone. First, I'd like to begin by just want to thank Dr. Pearman. Thank you for the introduction. And then we were just talking briefly about our connections. And we had talked over the telephone, I believe, about 2 or 3 years ago. My son, Kamal Muse Morris, over here, is a finishing up, graduating senior at Stanford here. So it's wonderful, you know, as a parent, in the African way they ask, how are the children? And so we know when the children are fine, then the family is doing well. But we were talking, thank you very much. Great to see some wonderful people in the audience. Want to give a special shout out to Dr. Brian Brown there. Dr. Brown, how you doing, sir? Wonderful, thank you for following up on that email, the text. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share my insights and bring some information from the dirty South to the West Side. I'm going to talk about all of that, okay? I really appreciate you and your family, all that you've done. You've been a wonderful mentor, and I know a wonderful professor and scholar here. Thank you. I also like to, I see some familiar faces. So Ramon, where are you? I saw him. We worked together. I was vice president for Division G, American Educational Research Association. He was one of my section chairs. Thank you. And my good friend and colleague, Dr. Alfredo Artiles right here. Wonderful seeing. So I feel at home. I feel at home. And thank you very much, Kendra. I want to thank you for all that you've done, you and Lucy and John and everybody else. So one of the things, as I stand here, I'm reminded of, I know there are a lot of young people in the audience. I saw a contingent group from Oakland, California that's here, Oakland represented. One of the things is that appreciate the fact that they're here, because what I want to do is, this talk is really about the fact that Jerome Morris stands here. But I don't just stand here speaking to you as Dr. Jerome Morris. I bring to you those experiences, those people from a little bitty place where I say a group of Africans who were transplanted across the Atlantic, placed into the bottom of slave ships, endured horrific experiences along the transatlantic slave trade and on the plantation, persevered through segregation, and then from moving from those plantations in Alabama, they ended up in the slums of Birmingham, Alabama. And from those slums, those people moved into public housing. And so I am that person who comes out of those experiences. We don't just say we're Black Americans or African Americans. We are really transplanted African people in the United States. So that's the energy in which I bring to you. I represent those people because I understand, when I grew up in that little village called Central City in Birmingham, I was really nurtured by those Black educators in those K through 12 Black schools. All the schools I attended, K through 12, were Black schools. Poor, disinvested, and neglected schools, though. I've written about that in an article in 2004 in the American Educational Research Journal called "Can Anything Good Come from Nazareth? Race, Class, and African American Schooling in the Urban South, the Midwest." It was the culmination of research I had done in Atlanta, Georgia, and St. Louis, Missouri. And so I bring that energy because I saw the sociological scholarship written about Black folk, written about Black people in such a way that presented, with all good intentions, many of them said, the deficits, bringing a structural lens to understand the dynamic experiences of Black people, but in many ways, framing Black folks without agency, framing Black folks in pathologically written ways. And so that was disturbing. Many of them talk about the promises of Brown versus Board of Education, often focusing only on that first promise. I don't know if everybody knows we're celebrating 70 years of Brown, right? And what is the emphasis in terms of celebrating the 70 years? It's often on the extent to which Brown eradicated legalized segregation. And that's what most people talk about. But I have a book. Well, let me go back. My book here, right here, Trouble in the Waters, Fulfilling the Promise of Quality Public Schooling for Black Children. I raised questions about Brown's second promise. Does anybody know what Brown's second promise was? Scholars, intellects, I'm just joking. Come on, folk, kinfolk. Brown's second promise was quality education for Black people. Why don't we hear people talking about that one? Because it does not emphasize Black children in white spaces. It's not about looking at Black people under the white gaze. It's about asking questions. In many ways, how do we assure or provide the resources for Black children, what Charles Hamilton Houston was arguing, providing the resources for Black children in those spaces to ensure that they had quality education. Brown had two promises: eradicating legalized segregation, quality education for Black children. My focus has been quality education. I got no love. I'm telling you, as a scholar, you get very little love, so you don't know about that work. You primarily know about this focus on Brown's first promise. Why? Because that work inherently forces us to deal with the Black poor. It forces us to deal with, still in 2024, we have 2 million Black children in US public schools that go to schools that are 75 to 90 to 99% Black. 2 million. But everybody wants to talk about how do we create nice racial integrated schools. I'm okay with that. I'm cool with that. But my point of it is, if we don't focus on the least of these, then the promises don't even matter. And that's the work and that's the energy. That's what I've committed my life to. I've committed my life to that because I grew up, my mother raised 6 boys and 1 girl in a housing project in Birmingham, Alabama called Central City. And I saw the love. We had these other parents. scholars now call them other mothers and other fathers. But these people nurtured me and they saw the talent within me. And they removed the barriers when they couldn't do, my mother couldn't do for us. They intervened and ensured that I had that support. And so I bring that as an epistemological framework. That's the thing we use, epistemology, right? Grad students, y'all doing that work? Yeah, we got to talk about what is your epistemological framework. Although people like to not talk about it, it is always there, right, Alfredo? It is always there. So the work that I do is really coming from that spirit in terms of that. And so what I've done, I'm going to talk about the work I've written, I've published in the American Educational Researcher, right here, focusing on a couple of pieces. Why Study the South is going to be the second part of my talk today. And I talked about that we need to think about the South as integral, crucial to understanding Black experiences. I have another piece in there that focuses on the closing of Black schools. All of my work is about Black people in Black spaces and the ways in how we build upon these strengths. And my work is communal. And I say communal, I'll talk about my theory of communally bonded school. It's communal in the sense that it's inspired by Du Bois's work and about how we need to think of education as additive. It's not subtractive, as Angela Valenzuela talked about in her work on subtractive schooling. When a child goes to school, a child should know their mama and grandmama name. You should know your cousin. You should know their nicknames. You know, they didn't call, my wife's real name is Mary, but everybody in West Tennessee calls her Tootsie. And so he said, you married Tootsie. That's right, I married Tootsie. So my point is that this is crucial. This kind of knowledge should bring you closer to who you are. You shouldn't go to school and stop being who you are. You know, it should bring you closer to who you are. That's an ancient Kemetic thing, y'all. And so what I'll do is I have a couple of things I'm going to do. One is this. I'll talk about this notion of Sankofa, and it's embedded in some of the work that I do. And I could talk about all the scholarship and everything, but I bring that all throughout here. Let me go to the next. So here's one thing, undergraduate students, master's students, PhD students, postdocs, you always got to think about what is your main research question. What are you interested in doing? And this is the work that I do. I'm really interested in what practices, reforms, policies, and beliefs promote equitable, healthy, culturally affirming, and academically enriching, I also would say intellectually stimulating educational experiences for historically marginalized populations. So that's really what I'm interested in right there. That captures all of it. So what practices, reforms, policies, and beliefs? So educating Black America in a Southern context. I would like for you to look at these maps here. The map to the left here is 2010. The map to the right here to my right is 2022 map. Just somebody from the audience in terms of what we see here. What do we see, a volunteer from the audience, what do we see here in terms of this map here? Anybody, just tell them, raise your hand. Yes. You see a lot of presence in the South, right? That's in 2010. Now we see some Black folks out here, right? A little bit out here. Some of that's Oakland, right? And Compton. Yeah. So I had to go to school to learn that Black folks were in the South, y'all. Can you believe that? Because guess what? Very little of the scholarship was written about Black people in the Southern experience. There was historic amnesia by the universities. You had to go to Chicago and New York to look at the Black migration, Isabel Wilkerson, and learn that Black folks had migrated, that there were Black people. And everybody talked about the Great Migration, like it's a fascinating phenomenon. I said, Black folks left, but millions of us stayed. But nobody's talking about that. And so I wrote a piece in 2009 in Educational Researcher when there was this big conversation about the academic achievement gap, about why study the South. Carla Monroe, was my postdoc working with me at the time. We raised the question, why study the South? The reason why you have to study the South, and the South should be central to any conversation about Black experience in America. I'm not just saying because I'm from Birmingham, I'm just saying it's the starting point. It's the historical home for African people who were enslaved in the United States. It's the starting point. How do we know? We know because up until 1910, 90% of Black people lived in 10 states. Even until 1930, when you started seeing the Great Migration, 70 to 80% of Black people. Even today, we see 56% of Black people live here in these states right here, more than half. And everybody out on the West Coast talking about going down south now. So people are here. And why is that important? Because the whole issue around language. I know this is a series, Race, Inequality, and Language in Education. We have great scholars, John Ball, I know was here, Anita Ball. We have all of them who've done this work. And I just saw John Ball recently in St. Louis. And the thing is that we talked about the centrality of the South in terms of understanding Black culture. And I'll read a little bit about that. But this is something that, as we say, you should marinate on here. So in that, when I talked about the work that I'm doing and how my work is inspired by Du Bois and this notion of looking at education as not an individualistic endeavor, but something that is collective. And Du Bois, in a piece he wrote in terms of the field and function of the Negro College, he had gone back to speak to his alma mater, Fisk University. And he talked about this whole sense of what the purpose of a Black university should be. And he was explaining to people that education is communal, in that in ancient times, humans for eons, when they really transmitted their knowledge and their culture from one generation to the next. And they did it in such a way that you never had any uneducated people. That's a deep thought. Nobody was uneducated because they learned, they knew. And so I'm highlighting here some of the components of the Center for Communally Bonded Research. It builds on the scholarship I've been developing over the years, and it's in a lot of different articles. And what I'm doing right now, I'm working on this major piece. It's going to come out soon, really lays out the whole theory, the theory of communally bonded schooling. But I have the Center for Communally Bonded Research, and we have three components. One is this philosophical concept, Sankofa. It's really about we should not separate the present from the past. This notion of time should not be thought of as linear. We always, you can even see it when people who've been traumatized, that they suffered trauma, they still can feel it as though something happened 30 years ago, they still feel it. We know it from that evidence. But this notion, Africans understood that Sankofa is a concept, West African Adinkra symbol, which means philosophical concept, means it's okay to go back and fetch that which you have lost. It's okay to go back and claim that which you don't remember. And so Sankofa is a guiding philosophical point. Then we have three components: the Race, Class, Place, and Outcomes Research Group, which is something that brings in speakers. And then we have CRESS, is community-based, co-creating community-based racial equity in STEM, Dr. Brian Brown. I say in STEM because I partnered with 5 community-based organizations in the St. Louis area. Black Girls Do STEM, Good Journey Development Foundation, National Society of Black Engineers, Incubator Scientists, and Men of Code 2019. I was an engineering major before Dr. Brian. Hey, but a lot of times you get railroaded as Black folks in fields. And I could give a whole story about that. But the point of it is that these organizations I work with, it's about focusing on the whole child, holistically. Because sometimes people think about STEM and they talk about content, but we're not talking about content. We're talking about the history, the culture, why, the political reasons why you need to be in this area. So that's what African people, that's what Black folks during those segregated schools. So it's about going back and reclaiming those strengths. We understand the fiscal neglect by a white power structure that limited the opportunities for Black people. We're going back to claim those strengths And those strengths said, don't just teach your child math and science, teach your child their history. Teach them high level education, PhD level education in high school. That's what it was about. So we have that. I'm vying for, I don't know if you're on the review committee, Dr. Brian. Hey, but I'm just messing with him here. I'm vying for an NSF grant, and hopefully, hopefully we get funded, because it's a great idea. We're really trying to shift this conversation from formal to informal educational spaces, and communal allows us that, a communally bonded framework. I'm going to share a little bit the framework here. Key point, and this is my work here. It's not all out in the universe yet in terms of this here, but pervasiveness of racial and class structures you have. And then we see this symbiosis here in terms of the child within the community, family, and school. Some of you probably recognize Bronfenbrenner's work, this system here, ecological systems theory. And so, but you have all these forces that shape the education of children and families and experiences. But then you have this broader social structure. So we exist within that. But for the people who are interested in more the practical, or interested in how do we operationalize this, I just want to highlight some of the key tenets, 5 tenets. These are characteristics in many ways, characteristics. And what I'm doing is I'm taking my empirically based research. I studied exemplary Black schools in St. Louis, Missouri. I did that as part of my PhD at Vanderbilt University. I saw these schools that were very reminiscent of what James Anderson wrote in History of Black Education in the South. The work that Vanessa Siddle Walker had done when she looked at Caswell County Training School in North Carolina and talked about the good within those segregated spaces. The Black educators Michelle Foster wrote about, and also the work Faustine Jones, all of these people who captured these strengths within these Black educational spaces. And I combined that scholarship, the historical understanding, synthesize it with my work in St. Louis, then Atlanta, Georgia. And I came up with this framing, communally bonded schools. One is this intergenerational trust and cultural bonding between educators, adults, and students. 2 is a critical presence of Black educators. We have scholars now building on Michelle Foster's work, talking about that just having one Black teacher in a child's life can change the trajectory of that child's life. What if you had a critical mass in an entire school, good and bad? You know, people who love you, some who don't want to deal with you. But when you have a critical mass of Black educators, we know that this is one of the elements of communally bonded schooling, because it's something that we need to think about. So my work is not about, some people say, well, Jerome, given the limitations of Black educators, we need more. How can we do something in lieu of? This is theory, y'all. I'm not trying to do what's in lieu of. It's about what works. Okay, we need to talk about creating optimal educational spaces. Critical presence of Black educators. 3, educators reach out and engage Black families. 4, leaders bridge educational institutions and communities. And then 5, we have schools and educational organizations serve as pillars in communities. We know from our scholarship that the Black school, in terms of the history of Black education in America, we know that it was second in importance only to the Black family and the Black church. Black churches and Black schools are inextricably linked. We know Black schools came out of the Black church experience, particularly the AME church, created hundreds of Black schools for Black people. And so we have that connection. And so schools as pillars in Black communities. So here's some of the work that I've done, some of the people I've worked with the Community Center for Communally Bonded Schooling. Right here, I have a group of high school, middle school, high school, college, and PhD students. We all went together to AERA, this AERA in Philadelphia, the American Educational Research Association, and presented. In fact, these middle school students, when they apply to places, can say, I presented a scholarly paper. And so these are the groups I'm working with in St. Louis. We have some scholars here. I received an award, a couple of awards. They have a lecture series named after me at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. I'm not bragging too much, but it's named after me, the Jerome Lecture Series. I said, wow, I thought I'm not that old, but it's really because of my commitment to the Black presence in those spaces. I've been doing this for years. I work on an advisory board, a recovery board. There have been a lot of, sometimes we write about school closures. I'm on a committee to save schools in St. Louis, the oldest Black high school west of the Mississippi River, Sumner High School. Here I am in community garden working with young people like Kamal, my daughter Hamadi. I work with community groups. Here's, there's an icon right here. I'm in Ghana, West Africa here. And I am presenting a proclamation from us at the Center for Community Bonded Schooling, presenting it to Elaine Brown. And I know she spoke, she's been here several times. And we gave Elaine that, I gave her that on her 80th birthday. And so I was a specially invited guest. I went there, presented it to her, because I wanted to recognize and thank her for her leadership as the first and only female head of the Black Panther Party. One. Two, because the Black Panther Party created these free breakfast programs. And I was fed through those free breakfast programs. I'm the beneficiary of those programs. And I just thanked Elaine Brown for the work, because I recognize that radical and revolutionary minded people put pressure on status quo folks to make sure and do things for the poor folks. Because poor people ain't getting nothing unless, as Frederick Douglass said, you put pressure on the status quo. That's what Elaine did. And so we then saw the US government adopting this free breakfast program and spreading it. But we see a lot of it, the genesis of it, with the Black Panther Party. So the second part of my talk, I just got started. I got a little preacher in me. Didn't go to church much, Dr. Martin, but I got a little preacher in me, okay? So Central City's joy and pain, solidarity, survival, and soul in a Birmingham housing project. I'm going to read some excerpts from that and just want to say a little bit about this book. This book started as I had gotten a research grant when I was a professor at the University of Georgia to study the displacement of Black families from a public housing community in Birmingham, Alabama. It was the Hope 6 program. You familiar with, you know that, Doctor? Yeah, the Hope 6. And the Hope 6 was, it's a nice name, right? So Hope 6 was about, the whole premise of it, some of it's rooted in William Julius Wilson's ideas about this notion of deconcentrating poverty. And so you're going to deconcentrate poverty because the argument is that concentrated poverty is the problem, not the eradication of poverty, concentrated poverty. And so the Hope 6 program was set up, and I was studying, I wanted to interview these families because I noticed I wanted to, back in Birmingham, and I wanted to know, where did they go? I went and talked to the Birmingham Housing Authority. One of the people there said, Jerome, you don't really want to know where they went. In fact, I don't think we want to know. And so they didn't keep official records. Do you know, that happens quite a bit. They didn't keep official records. But here's the irony. My mama was in that housing project. I had my PhD. I was a professor at Vanderbilt University, and I went home and I lived in that housing project when I went for Thanksgiving, et cetera, and I slept on the couch in Central City in the housing project that eventually was raised in 2000. And so I found myself doing a sociological study that became a historical study of from the bottom up scholarship. Historians, you know that bottom up research. How do we tell the stories of people at the bottom? We now have something in critical race theory talks about that too, is giving voice to those at the bottom. So I found myself studying my family. I saw my sister and my mother get displaced. And I saw the horrific consequences of that when they raised it. And there was very little I can do. My mother asked me, Jerome, particularly when I was in grad school at Vanderbilt, finishing up my PhD. She said, Jerome, can you give me $100 to pay for a dough that these people say I need to pay for? You know, when I say dough, that's door. That these people need to pay, they want me to pay for it because if I don't pay for this door, they won't let me move back in. So I had to be reflexive. I was talking to my friends and all of my relatives about this to the point I had 40 interviews, oral history interviews of friends and family members. And that's what this book comes out of. So it became a memoir then. It's like a memoir. So I was studying this community filtered through my lens as a Black male growing up in that community. And so that was the fascinating piece about it. So here I'm going to show you, I'm just trying to be mindful of my time. Maybe I have about 15 more minutes here. This is a map of Birmingham. Many of you have heard of 16th Street Baptist Church. You heard of that? Yeah, this is, so Central City is about 4 blocks from that church. Nobody writes about Central City though. So this is where it is. We're in the center of the state almost. Then we have, this is community. What I did is I recreated what the community was like. So how do we go back archival work and recreate a community that has now been gentrified? This is how it looks now. And so we see the tree is torn down. This is how it looks today in 2023. But this is how it looked at one point. Okay, so I'm going to read from The Poorest Zip Code in America, chapter 1. Block parties, freeze cups, shooting marbles, the best girls softball teams, the Sugar Jets football team, kissing in the hallways, fighting, borrowing butter and eggs, Powell School, my mama, 5 older brothers, and a younger sister, the free summer lunch program, the double Dutch bus, Mr. Hook's store, the Electric Poppers and the Central City Poppers, free school breakfast and lunch, Duvilles, and the music of Frankie Beverly and Mays. This was the Birmingham so many of us knew. This was the Central City Housing Project. Going to be, so we have a photo here. We see this photo right here is, so this is a high school. I went to Phillips High School. It was the premier white high school in Birmingham. And there are stories in the book. You got to read the book though. But this is Central City Housing Project. A housing project originally slated for white people, but eventually becomes a predominantly Black housing project and becomes the poorest zip code in the United States during the 1970s, 73% poverty level in that community. So everything in the book is taking place within this vicinity here, the entire book. I'm going to read. So one of the things that I want to say about being there, a lot of times people would ask me, with some familiarity with Birmingham, they might ask me which part of town I lived in or where I had attended school. I usually told them that I grew up in downtown. They were familiar with 16th Street Baptist Church. They were familiar with the church bombing and everything, Dr. King, the Children's Crusade. But then these people would probe deeper. Where exactly did you grow up, Jerome? They'd ask. And I'd answer, Central City, a public housing project. How do you get out of the projects and become a professor? What's a typical follow-up question? I tailored my response to the audience, reminded them of a more appropriate question. Why do so many Black people, after deep sacrifices and fights for freedom over hundreds of years, even have to deal with the idea of trying to get up out of the hood? Had not the blood, sweat, and tears that our ancestors shed been enough to ensure that we no longer have to endure such horrific living conditions? That's the perennial question here. Why are Black folks fighting to get up out of some hoods in this country? We know it's built on the backs of indigenous folks, the genocide against indigenous First Nations people, but then the slave labor of Black folks in terms of fueling what Cedric Robinson and other scholars talk about as racial capitalism. It's like Shark Tank talks about startup capital. You know, as Malcolm X said, you become rich, richer than rich. So this is reality that the United States is. And that's why I rephrased that question, you know, beyond this notion of how did you get up out of the hood type thing. So let me continue here. So one of the things that in this book is I talk about chapter 2 before the projects. This is a photo of my mother, and here's a photo of my biological father. Y'all know why I said that, right? This is my biological father in the sense that this is a community where we used to live. So here's my mother. This is what we call Central City, somewhat called Central City, after it had been refurbished. But before, we lived in this area here in 1968. This is 1968, y'all. It looks like 1930s, right? But this is Birmingham. This is the community. This is the house where we live. And I was, up until I was like 1 year of age, 1 year. And we moved from that community in 1968, 2 weeks after, well, in December 1968. Prior to that, we know Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, April 4th. But before then, Congress was filibustering the Fair Housing Act. But 2 weeks after Dr. King's assassination, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act after decades of filibustering it. We've seen something like this, right? George Floyd, let's help Black folks out, but then pull back now. So one of the things is that we saw similarly with the Fair Housing Act. This is how my family moved into Central City, moved from the slum into a housing project for white people. And so here are my siblings, just gonna flip a little fast. Here are 5 of my siblings and my sister, 4 of my brothers and my sister. And here's my brother, Michael, they call him Big Meaty, and my Aunt Sandra. And so there's a chapter 3 I have called Convergence. And chapter 3, in it, I talk about how we got to Central City and what happened once we were in Central City. Just give me 1 second here. So I'm going to read a quote from my aunt named Sandra. She was she's featured here. That's Aunt Sandra there. She said, "Woo, child, Joanne kept that apartment clean when y'all were little growing up there. She wasn't nasty. Can nobody say that about her?" said Aunt Sandra, one of my mother's younger sisters. The milkman, who was white, would deliver bottles of locally owned Barber's milk that was placed inside a plastic crate. He placed the filled bottles of milk on the apartment steps in exchange for the empty bottles. Moreover, when the grass had gotten too high, Central City's maintenance staff promptly mowed the lawn. The mostly white residents in Central City could count on maintenance workers timely repairing and painting of the premises. My 2 older brothers, Ronnie and Richard Jr., vividly recalled our family's move out of the coat. They remembered the drastic change from wood-burning stoves and the poorly insulated dwellings in the coat. It's spelled C-O-U-R-T. We say coat, C-O-A-T, to the comforting warmth of the radiator heat in Central City. They cherished the memories and lasting friendships with their Black peers in the alley and the coat. They also remember playing and laughing with their new white peers in Central City and what Richard Jr. described as the peace between Black and white people. According to Ronnie, Central City was paradise. The sense of peace and paradise that Richard Jr. and Ronnie felt during those early days, however, quickly vanished as the numbers of Black people moving into Central City increased. Black people began experiencing backlash and white rage from some white people who resented these minor civil rights gains. We were, according to Ronnie Richard Jr., the second Black family to move into Central City, and other Black families who knew us would follow. White people keenly watched the Black families move in. At first, there were only a few Black families in Central City, and Ronnie and Richard Jr. felt welcomed by the white families and children. Then, other Black families moved in, and white parents began to show their rage, as my mother described during an interview I conducted with her in 1998, a few years before commencing the Central City Research Project. She said, quote, "This little girl's mother called the police on Richard. I then yelled to the woman and asked her, why would she call the police on a 7-year-old child? He's just a little boy." Our mother then asked Richard why he hit the girl, and Richard reminded our mother that she had taught him to hit back if anyone ever hit him. Don't start no stuff, won't be no stuff. So one of the things, I say that because there's often this narrative about Black people in the South and that Black folks didn't fight back. You get this book, you'll see that there were Black people who walked through that community, who literally fought back. You never will read those stories. And why is that important? It's not important in terms of violence. It's important in terms of Black resistance. That's why it's important, because it then helps you to understand, and you walk around with this sense that we didn't just take stuff. So that's why that becomes important to understand. So this is a photo of in 1930s, 1939, 1940, 1942, Franklin Delano Roosevelt really pushed for ways of saving white families. And just like we saw with the stimulus money, right? What did they call it? The stimulus money? Why did they call it welfare? It was welfare. So nevertheless, different language for different folks. So this is what it was when white people were there. Here's how it was in the 70s and 80s. We just see 3 Black men here, but somebody should cut this grass, right? The residents don't do that. Somebody needs to paint. There's another story around here. This is about the high school. Chapter 9, going to school. I wanted to say a little bit. We have about a few more minutes. How's our time here? About 10 more minutes. So I'll probably get back to that. I want to read some excerpts. It's chapter 20 called That's Home. And these excerpts, this part comes from some of the participants in the study. I especially focus on 2 Black women who I grew up with. One, I called her Tabitha, and the other is called Charlene. And this is after the community had been razed or demolished, and it was no longer there. And I began, I don't like staying here in this new residence. I miss Central City. I miss home. I want to go back, but then I don't want to go back. Those words from Tabitha, a childhood friend from Central City, captured the ambivalence that Black women often experience about living in and then moving out of public housing. They struggle to reconcile the sense of community with the negative perceptions of public housing communities. Unfortunately, these perceptions often portray Black women and mothers in stereotypical ways, ignoring that they are mothers, daughters, wives, and sisters. Moreover, Black women in public housing have to fight against images that depict them as lazy welfare queens and as promiscuous. Tabitha did not want to go back to the projects, not because it was a place she despised, but because Black women in public housing always have to fight for their dignity and respect. It mattered not if they supported their families by working or staying at home to raise their children. My interviews with Tabitha and another childhood friend, Charlene, further illustrate Black women's resistance to stereotypical images and reaffirm the home that Central City had become for generations of Black people. By 2005, a few years after the Birmingham Housing Authority had converted Central City into a Hope Sits project called Park Place, most of the people I had known while growing up no longer lived there. As part of the research study that I was leading on the displacement of Black families, I stopped by the Birmingham Housing Authority's office to inquire about where the former residents from Central City had moved. I exchanged messages with the staff, but no one provided any information that I found helpful. I contacted the office of the mayor and spoke to a Black woman in the economic development office who said, honestly, I don't know if people really wanted to know where those people from Central City went. After speaking with this employee, I realized that one of the strategies of displacing people is not to keep any records of their new places of residence or their housing situation. I then reached out to the Hope Sits program project manager at Black Mill I had met before. I tried interviewing him, but he too refused to provide any information or agree to an interview with me. Okay. I want to go back, want to say a little something about going to school, chapter 9. I want to read a little bit from that. Then I'll open it up to questions from you. So I want to read just something here. My kindergarten teacher was Miss Green, a Black woman with sandy colored hair. Maurice, 2 years older than me, was in 5th grade. Michael in 3rd grade. Kenneth in 4th grade at another school. Richard Jr. in 6th grade and Ronnie in 8th grade. Our sister Shelda was still a baby, not even 1 year of age. My 1st grade teacher was a white woman. My 2nd grade teacher was a Black woman. 2nd grade was memorable when I was referred to the school's speech pathologist, a Black woman named Miss Summer. Like many Black people speaking in a Southern Black vernacular, particularly those from lower and working class backgrounds, I often said "da" for "th." Miss Summer, a brown-skinned woman with an afro and large glasses, showed patience when working with me. I'm quoting her. She said, "Jerome, put your tongue between your teeth like this," showing me how she placed her teeth. "Do this while blowing air out of your mouth. See, making the th sound over and over. Now you try it, Jerome." "Duh." "It's kind of hard to do," I said. Miss Summers says, "Keep trying. It takes a little patience and a little practice." Miss Summer interjected when I asked whether I should go with her to her office instead of with her. Like many Black people in Birmingham, we spoke using the pronunciation and grammatical rules of what linguists now refer to as African American English or African American Vernacular English, AAVE. Rather than correct our speech, Miss Summer would say, "That is how you would probably say the word at home or around your friends in Central City. But here's how we say it at school." While working on my PhD 20 years after I had first stepped into a school, I began reading books and articles about how Black children's speaking styles had become a contentious educational debate in the United States. During the 1990s, the Oakland, California School Board had passed a resolution acknowledging AAVE, commonly referred to as Ebonics, as the primary or home language spoken by most Black students in the district. Board members asserted that white educators should consider Black students' home language when teaching them standard English. Years before the Oakland Ebonics debate, however, a judge in Ann Arbor, Michigan, ordered teachers to incorporate Black English when teaching Black children living in poverty standard American English. Occasionally, I reflected on my experiences learning from Miss Summer at Powell School while learning about African American Vernacular English in graduate school. I'm going to stop there and take some questions. Thank you very much for your patience.
Okay, we have a couple minutes before we finish up. I'm going to kick us off with just like one general question, and then we're going to field questions from the group. So, Professor Morris, you got handful of graduate students in the room,
Yes.
budding scholars, right? One thing that struck me in your talk was, this concept of like positionality, right?
Yes.
The things that we bring with us to the topics, to the issues that we're interested in exploring, right? I'm curious, and certainly, I mean, your work, your positionality figures very prominently in that work. I'm curious if you could, speaking to graduate students in particular, can you talk a little bit about what you've learned is gained through your positionality, your experience, your history growing up, in terms of the specific topics that we talked about today. And then secondly, can you just, if we could take one kind of step back and think about the challenges that your positionality has presented to you, right? In terms of exploring the work in meaningful, nuanced, quote unquote, objective ways. I'm just curious about that tension, like how you've played out that tension.
Right. That's a great question. Let me begin with the second question.
Yeah.
Second part. One of the things is that I was taught in grad school that Vanderbilt don't talk about that, and so one of the things I realized is that I could not have written this book, even though it was there 25 years ago. Why? Because I hadn't fully interrogated the fact that I had grown up in certain kind of environment. I was at a university, predominantly white universities, coming out of predominantly Black K-12 experiences. So in some ways, I had to think through it. So you suppress some aspects of your identity. I didn't talk about how I played football. A lot of people, I didn't even talk about that until recently. I had a graduate student working on his PhD, Adeoye Adeyemo, who said, I want to do work because you played college football. I said, wow. So my point is that it took time to be able to think like this and to be reflexive like this. It took time. And the time was, but also, one of the things that by going through traditional spaces, you learned about certain things, the rigor and how to, we learned about reflexivity, you learned about positionality, but I didn't give it all the attention it deserved in my scholarship. And so that was the first phase of my life. So one of the things I was doing, I was talking with Brian about this, about the reason why I published this book with the University of Georgia Press. I had published my first book with Teachers College Press. I like the book, but I like this one better, And the reason why I like this one better, because I had the creativity to do it the way I wanted to do it. And also, I told them, here's how I'm doing this book. And I had competing offers. And I said, I'm doing it this way. And this is not a memoir. Everybody keeps telling me it is. I said, this is a study of a community, a social study, like a social study like Du Bois, but a community study that I'm thinking about it sociologically and historically. And but I'm telling you this story through the lens of a Black male growing up there. The other reason why that's crucial in terms of positionality, particularly for people who've gotten who've been dealt a bad blow, is that I think about this work Du Bois talked about, the criteria for Negro art. And Du Bois always challenged people and said that everything is propaganda. The bad part is those who are empowered telling you that your work is propaganda. But they don't tell you that their whole enterprise is a game of propaganda. And the research they've done is why we don't know about good coming out of Nazareth. The strength is why nobody talks about those brilliant Black schools that were closed with names like Dunbar, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, W.E.B. Du Bois. Why are people letting those schools get closed that connect the children to their history? But that's why this is done. That's a long answer. I'm a professor.
I'm taking it.
I'm sorry.
No, I appreciate what I heard you say in the answer. And I think this is cool. This idea that over time you've gained perspective on your positionality.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes,
and
sir.
that the notion that perspective can alter, can mature, can change as one grows. I've got more questions, but don't have any time for my questions. Any questions from the room? Okay, first hand goes up. Yes, you got it.
Thank you. Yes.
Is what are your thoughts on okay, thank you. What are your thoughts on folks wanting to research areas that they don't immediately identify with? So like somebody on the outside coming in and observing the histories that you're talking about, like within your work, like what would a positionality look like for you, or what are your thoughts on that of people researching?
Part of the reason why this book was written is the book, I was thinking about publishing it with an educational press or something like that. I realized the book is really about urban planning and the failure of urban planning for the Black poor. And so I've read a lot of books on that. I was reading about Cabrini Green, Robert Taylor Holmes, Chicago. You know, that's all I learned about the projects, was reading about Black people in New York and Chicago, and never about Black people in New Orleans and Birmingham and Nashville. And so this is a kind of a counter to that. So the work is already out there. There's a plethora of scholarship books on Black people in the project, folks going in and learning about spending time with gangs and hanging out with gangs and being an insider, imic. They're using, and they got all the nice language, you know, insider, and immerse themselves into the community and start writing about the people's experiences. That is already out there. And so part of the inspiration, the motivation, and why I was compelled to do this was driven by, I was reading those works and said, that's not right. I don't know what that is. It looked like American Fiction, the movie. You know, this caricature of Black people. I said, that's not it. That's why we have to think about a lot of the scholarship from anthropology, psychology, particularly anthropology. You know, a lot of it is about studying others. We think about the word ethnic. The word is a Greek word. It comes from others. And so that's the way scholarship or research has been presented. Some of us are really trying to shift the paradigm with that. That's what this is about. And there's a community of scholars. Some of you are in here who are part of that effort. But thank you for that question.
Okay, we are out of time. If you all don't mind joining me in a round of applause for Professor Morris.
And I have some books to sell too.
All right, one more announcement. First of all, one round of applause for Dr. Morris. So what I would like you to do is to really think about the power of urban planning, those city decisions. Dr. Morris will be here. We'll set up a table. First 10 copies are on me for COCO students and PhD students. First 10 are on me, but you got to do something with this brilliant information you're going to get, and that's the challenge. So welcome one more time, and thank Dr. Morris, and we're going to bring the books forward so you can get a signature. One more time, round of applause for Dr. Morris.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Brown.